After analyzing over 400 hours of interrogation footage with some of the most dangerous minds ever documented, forensic psychologists discovered 22 chilling truths about how these individuals think, manipulate, and control. What they revealed will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people around you. Because here's what nobody tells you. The most dangerous person you'll ever meet won't look dangerous. They'll look normal. They'll sound reasonable. And by the time you realize what's happening, they'll already be inside your head. Let me take you into a windowless room where Detective Sarah Morrison sat across from a man named Daniel Carr. Carr had been arrested for orchestrating an elaborate financial scheme that destroyed 17 families. But that's not what made him remarkable. What made him remarkable was how calm he was, how present, how he leaned forward when Sarah spoke, nodded at exactly the right moments, and maintained eye contact that felt almost uncomfortably intimate. 3 hours into the interrogation, Sarah found herself defending him to her own partner. She caught herself making excuses for his behavior, and that's when she realized she'd been manipulated by someone who was handcuffed to a table. This is the reality of manipulation. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a mask. It slips into your mind like smoke under a door, and by the time you smell it, the room is already filling up. The forensic psychologists who studied these interrogations weren't just looking for confessions. They were mapping the architecture of control. They were documenting the exact techniques that allow one human being to hijack another's reality. And what they found was a playbook, a systematic approach that transcends individual killers, con artists, and predators. These patterns repeat because they work. They work on smart people. They work on careful people. They work on you. The first truth they discovered is this. Every master manipulator begins with observation. Not casual observation. Surgical observation. They're looking for your tells, your vulnerabilities, the tiny cracks in your psychological armor that you don't even know exist. In one interrogation, a woman named Patricia Leeds explained how she identified targets for her elaborate romance scams. She said she watched how people held their coffee cups in cafes, how they scrolled through their phones, whether they made eye contact with strangers. She was looking for loneliness, for need, for that slight hesitation that says, I'm not quite sure of myself. And once she found it, she knew exactly where to apply pressure. You do this too, by the way. You reveal yourself constantly. The way you apologize when someone bumps into you. The way you over-explain your decisions. The way you fill silence because quiet makes you uncomfortable. These aren't character flaws. They're human traits. But to someone who's watching, really watching, they're a roadmap. They're instructions for how to get inside. Think about the last time you met someone new and immediately felt comfortable with them. Like you'd known them forever. Like they just understood you. That feeling wasn't an accident. Understanding can be manufactured. Comfort can be engineered. And the people who are best at this aren't doing it to make you feel good. They're doing it because comfortable people have their guard down. The second truth is about mirroring, but not the kind you've read about in pop psychology articles. This is mirroring at a neurological level. The interrogators noticed that the most effective manipulators didn't just copy body language. They synchronized their breathing with their targets. They matched speech patterns so subtly that it happened below conscious awareness. They created what neuroscientists call limbic resonance. Your brain is wired to trust people who seem like you. It's evolutionary. It kept our ancestors alive in tribal societies. But in the modern world, this hardwiring is a vulnerability. And manipulators know it. There was a case involving a man named Robert Chin who infiltrated a tight-knit community organization and embezzled nearly $2 million over 4 years. When investigators interviewed the board members, every single one described Chun the same way. Like talking to myself, they said. Like he got me. One board member, a retired teacher named Margaret, said Chun even used the same obscure phrase her father used to say. He couldn't have known that. But somehow the conversation always felt familiar. That's because Chun spent months studying these people before he ever asked for access to the accounts. He collected their speech patterns like data points. He absorbed their values, their beliefs, their pet phrases. And then he played them back like a mirror that only showed what they wanted to see. You need to understand something critical here. Your brain doesn't process manipulation as manipulation. It processes manipulation as connection, as rapport, as chemistry. The warm feeling you get when someone seems to understand you isn't evidence that they're trustworthy. It's just evidence that they've successfully activated your social bonding circuits. And those circuits don't have a built-in authentication system. They can't tell the difference between genuine connection and engineered connection. That's the design flaw manipulators exploit. The third truth is about the weapon of selective vulnerability. This is counterintuitive, so pay attention. You've been taught that manipulators are cold, calculating, emotionless. But the footage shows something different. The most effective manipulators share vulnerabilities. They confess weaknesses. They show you their wounds. Not all of them, just enough, just the right ones. Because when someone shows you their pain, your defenses collapse. You stop questioning. You start protecting. In the interrogation room, a man named Eric Dalton spent 20 minutes describing his difficult childhood before investigators could even ask about the charges. He talked about his absent father, his struggles with self-worth, his fear of abandonment, and the detectives, trained professionals who'd seen every tactic in the book, found themselves softening, found themselves thinking maybe there's more to the story. That's the genius of selective vulnerability. It reframes the power dynamic. Suddenly you're not dealing with a threat. You're dealing with a wounded person who needs understanding. Your protective instincts kick in. Your empathy overrides your judgment. And while you're busy trying to help, trying to understand, trying to heal, the manipulator is advancing their agenda. They're getting the information they need, the access they need, the trust they need. One forensic psychologist described it this way. They give you a key that opens nothing, and you're so grateful for the gesture of trust that you hand them the keys to everything. Here's how you recognize this in real life. Someone you barely know shares something deeply personal too soon. Feels like intimacy, like you've been chosen for their confidence. But ask yourself why. Why would someone who just met you trust you with their darkest secrets? The answer is usually simple. Because that vulnerability isn't real intimacy. It's a transaction. They're giving you something that feels valuable, so you'll feel obligated to give something back. And what you give back is usually far more valuable than what they shared. You give back your trust, your loyalty, your willingness to overlook red flags, because surely someone who showed you their pain can't also be dangerous. The fourth truth is about language manipulation, and this goes deeper than you think. The interrogators noticed that certain subjects never used the word "I" when discussing their crimes. They used passive construction. Mistakes were made. Things happened. It was a difficult situation. This isn't just evasion. It's a sophisticated technique that reconstructs reality itself. By removing personal agency from their language, they're removing personal responsibility from the narrative. And if you're not paying attention, your brain accepts this reconstructed reality without question. You start thinking about the situation instead of the person, about the circumstances instead of the choices. There was a corporate executive named Linda Rothman who destroyed her company through systematic fraud. When she finally spoke to investigators, she never said, "I falsified the reports." She said the numbers needed adjustment. The discrepancies required management. The accounts were optimized for stakeholder confidence. Notice what's missing. She's missing. Her actions are missing. In their place is this abstract system of needs and requirements that seems to exist independent of human choice. And if you let this language wash over you without active resistance, you start seeing the situation through her frame. You start thinking, well, maybe the numbers did need adjustment. Maybe this was just aggressive accounting. Maybe everyone does this. That's the power of linguistic manipulation. It doesn't argue with your reality. It slowly replaces it. You encounter this constantly. Someone doesn't lie to you. The truth was shaded. They didn't betray your confidence. The information needed to be shared. They didn't manipulate you. You misunderstood their intentions. Pay attention to the language people use, especially when they're explaining behavior that hurt you. If they're removing themselves from the sentence, they're removing themselves from responsibility. And if you accept that framing, You're left holding responsibility that isn't yours. You're left questioning your own perception instead of their actions. That's exactly where they want you. The fifth truth involves something the psychologists called strategic inconsistency. You'd think manipulators would be consistent, that they'd maintain a stable persona. But the footage revealed the opposite. The most effective manipulators deliberately contradict themselves. They show you different versions of themselves in different contexts. And instead of seeing this as deception, your brain tries to reconcile the contradictions. Creates a more complex, more human, more forgivable narrative. There was a religious leader named Thomas Vance who'd been abusing his position for decades. When congregants were interviewed, they described him as both gentle and stern, humble and confident, selfless and demanding. These contradictions didn't make them suspicious. They made them more devoted, because in their minds, anyone who contained that much complexity must be profound, must be special, must be operating on a level they didn't fully understand. This is a cognitive trap. Your brain is designed to create coherent narratives. When you encounter contradictory information about a person, your mind doesn't flag it as deception. It upgrades the person to a more sophisticated category. You think they're nuanced. You think they're deep. You think those contradictions are evidence of authenticity because real people are complicated, right? But there's a difference between natural human complexity and weaponized inconsistency. Natural complexity has a coherent core. You can trace the values. You can predict the patterns. Weaponized inconsistency is deliberately incoherent. Keeps you off balance. Keeps you guessing. Keeps you engaged in the exhausting work of trying to understand someone who's designed to be incomprehensible. Here's how to protect yourself. Stop trying to reconcile contradictions in someone's behavior. If they're generous one day and cruel the next, don't create a story that makes both true. Hold the contradiction. Let it stay uncomfortable. Let it stay unresolved. Because that discomfort is information. That's your nervous system telling you something isn't right. The moment you smooth over a contradiction with a narrative that makes it make sense, you've handed control to the person creating the contradictions. They're not confused about who they are. You are. And your confusion is the point. The sixth truth is about the manipulation of time. In the interrogation footage, psychologists noticed that dangerous subjects would compress or expand time in their narratives. Events that happened over months would be described as quick decisions. Calculated campaigns would be framed as impulsive moments. This temporal distortion isn't accidental. It's designed to prevent you from seeing the pattern. Because patterns require time. They require sequence. They require you to remember what happened first, second, third. If someone can control how you perceive time, they can control how you perceive cause and effect. They can make premeditation look like spontaneity. They can make systematic abuse look like isolated incidents. A woman named Jessica Morrow ran an elaborate elder abuse scheme for 7 years. When she was finally caught, she described her crimes as a series of moments where she just needed help and things went too far. But investigators who reconstructed the timeline found something very different. They found calculated planning. They found systematic escalation. They found a long-term strategy that required patience, foresight, and deliberate manipulation. But Jessica's narrative collapsed all that time into a blur of need and circumstance. And if you only heard her version, you'd never see the architecture of what she built. Think about the relationships in your life where you felt confused, where you couldn't quite figure out when things went wrong. There's a good chance time was being manipulated. Someone telling you you're overreacting to one incident when really you're reacting to a pattern of 50 incidents. Someone saying this just started when really it's been building for a year. Someone compressing their betrayal into a moment of weakness when really it was a campaign they executed across months. Time is your ally in detecting manipulation. Patterns need time to become visible. So when someone is rushing you, pressuring you to decide quickly, move fast, commit before you're ready, that urgency is often a weapon. They're trying to prevent you from seeing the pattern that would become obvious if you just had time to think. The seventh truth is the most disturbing. The forensic psychologists found that master manipulators don't feel like they're doing anything wrong. This isn't denial. This isn't rationalization after the fact. They genuinely experience their manipulation as something else, as persuasion, as helping people see reason, as giving people what they really want even if they don't know they want it. In one particularly chilling interview, a man named Gregory Hart, who destroyed countless lives through his schemes, said something that still haunts the investigators. He said, "I was just better at understanding what people needed than they were. I was doing them a service." This is the truth that makes manipulation so dangerous. The person doing it often doesn't register themselves as the villain. They've constructed an internal narrative where they're the hero, where their targets are willing participants, where any harm caused was ultimately necessary or beneficial or deserved. This means you can't rely on them having a conscience that kicks in. You can't rely on them feeling guilty and stopping. You can't appeal to their better nature because in their reality, this is their better nature. They're not breaking rules. They're playing a different game where the rules don't apply. And in that game, you're not a person. You're a puzzle, a resource, a means to an end. How do you spot this? Listen for absolute certainty. Listen for someone who never seems to doubt themselves, never seems to question whether they might be wrong, never seems to consider anyone else's perspective as equally valid as their own. Healthy people doubt. Healthy people question. Healthy people occasionally think, maybe I'm the one who's confused here. Manipulators don't do this. They can't afford to, because doubt would require them to consider that their targets aren't characters in their story, that their targets are actual people with inner lives as real as their own. And that consideration would break the spell, would make manipulation impossible. So they maintain absolute certainty, absolute conviction, and they express that certainty with such confidence that you start doubting yourself instead of doubting them. The eighth truth involves what the psychologists called empathy scanning. This sounds paradoxical because we think of manipulators as lacking empathy. But the footage showed something more complicated. Many of these individuals had empathy. They could read emotions accurately. They could predict responses. They could sense vulnerability. They just didn't care about the well-being attached to those emotions. They had cognitive empathy without effective empathy. They understood what you felt. They just didn't feel bad about exploiting it. There was a case involving a therapist named Dr. Michael Bourne who'd been manipulating clients for years. He was exceptional at reading people, at sensing their fears, their desires, their weaknesses. Clients described him as the most intuitive person they'd ever met. He knew what they were feeling before they did, but he wasn't using that ability to heal. He was using it to identify pressure points, to know exactly what to say to keep them dependent, to understand how much he could take before they'd break. That's empathy scanning. It's reading your emotional state not to connect with you, but to calibrate how much manipulation you can handle before you resist. You know this feeling. You're talking to someone and they're incredibly perceptive. They notice things about you that no one else notices. They understand you in ways that feel almost supernatural. It's intoxicating. Feels like being seen. But ask yourself what they're doing with that understanding. Are they using it to support you or to position themselves? Are they reflecting your emotions back to help you process them? Or are they storing that information for later use? Because the ability to read people is neutral. It's what someone does with that ability that matters. And if you're only paying attention to how good it feels to be understood, you might miss what's being built with your emotional data. The ninth truth is about the manipulation of isolation. The interrogators found a consistent pattern. Before the major manipulation begins, there's always a period of subtle separation. The target gets gradually disconnected from their support systems. Not dramatically, not in a way that's obvious, just slowly, incrementally, one relationship at a time. A man named Stephen Pierce ran a cult-like organization for 15 years. When survivors were interviewed about how it happened, they all described the same process. First, their new community within the organization became the most important thing, the most rewarding thing, the place where they felt most understood. And compared to that intensity, their old relationships started feeling hollow, superficial, unsupportive. So they drifted away, not because Stephen told them to, but because he'd created an environment where everything outside the group felt less real. This is sophisticated manipulation because it doesn't look like control. It looks like choice. You're choosing to spend more time with someone, choosing to confide in them instead of your old friends, choosing to prioritize their opinions over your family's concerns. But those choices are happening inside a manufactured context, inside an environment that's been carefully designed to make everything outside feel inadequate. And by the time you realize you've been isolated, you're already dependent on the person who isolated you. You need them. They've become your primary source of validation, support, and reality itself. Watch for this pattern. If someone new in your life is somehow always available exactly when your old friends aren't, if they're subtly critical of your existing relationships, if they create situations where choosing them means disappointing someone else, if their version of closeness requires distance from everyone else, that's not intimacy. That's strategic isolation. And it's a setup. Because once you're isolated, once they're your only source of connection and support, you can't leave. Where would you go? Who would you turn to? You've already burned those bridges, or let them burn, or watched them burn while someone whispered that it was for the best. The 10th truth is the manipulation of narrative. The psychologists found that dangerous individuals are exceptional storytellers. They don't just tell you what happened. They tell you what it means. They provide the interpretation before you can form your own. There was a financial advisor named Richard Moss who stole millions from his clients. When everything collapsed and people tried to reconstruct what happened, they realized Richard had been narrating their reality for years. He'd tell them what to think about market fluctuations, what to feel about their portfolios, what their anxiety meant, what their doubts meant, what their instincts meant. And because he was so confident, so articulate, so seemingly knowledgeable, they accepted his narrative. They let him define their reality. And by the time they realized the narrative was fiction, their money was gone. This is happening to you more than you know. Someone tells you what you're really feeling, what you really meant when you said that thing, what your behavior really indicates. And if you're not careful, you accept their interpretation instead of trusting your own experience. You think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am being oversensitive. Maybe I did overreact. Maybe my perception is distorted. This is narrative manipulation at its most dangerous. Because once someone else is interpreting your reality, you've handed them control of your mind. You're no longer trusting your own judgment. You're checking your thoughts and feelings against someone else's version of you. And their version always serves their interests, not yours. Protect your narrative. When someone tells you what you really think or really feel or really mean, stop. That's a boundary violation disguised as insight. They don't have access to your internal experience. Only you do. If you feel hurt, you feel hurt. If you feel uncomfortable, you feel uncomfortable. If something feels wrong, something is wrong. Don't let anyone narrate those feelings away. Don't let anyone reinterpret your experience into something more convenient for them. Your perception isn't perfect. No one's is, but it's yours. And the moment you start trusting someone else's interpretation of your reality more than you trust your own experience, you've given them power that no one should have. The 11th truth is about manufactured urgency. The interrogation footage revealed that manipulators rarely give you time to think. They create pressure. They create crisis. They create situations where you have to decide now, act now, commit now. A woman named Carol Jennings ran a series of investment scams that destroyed hundreds of families. Her primary tactic was creating artificial deadlines. This opportunity closes tonight. These terms expire at midnight. Someone else is interested and I can only hold this for another hour. None of it was true. But the urgency made people bypass their judgment, made them ignore red flags, made them act before they could think or consult or do their due diligence. Urgency is a weapon because your brain operates differently under time pressure. You shift from your prefrontal cortex, where you analyze and reason, to your amygdala, where you react and survive. You stop asking whether you should do something and start asking how fast you can do it. And manipulators know this. They know that given time, you'll probably see through them. You'll probably ask the right questions. You'll probably consult people who'll warn you. So they eliminate time. They create pressure. They make the window so small that your only option is to act on instinct. And instinct, when it's been primed by someone who knows what they're doing, will lead you exactly where they want you to go. When someone is pushing you to decide quickly, that's information. When someone says this opportunity won't last, that's information. When someone makes you feel like thinking it over means losing out, that's information. And that information is usually telling you to slow down, to take exactly the time you need, to let the opportunity pass if it won't wait. Because anything real will still be real tomorrow. Any offer worth taking will survive scrutiny. Any relationship worth having will respect your need to think. Urgency is almost always artificial. It's almost always manufactured. And it's almost always designed to prevent you from seeing something you'd see if you just had time to look. The 12th truth is about the exploitation of reciprocity. This is hardwired into you. When someone does something for you, you feel obligated to do something back. The social glue. It's how communities function. But manipulators weaponize it. They give you things you didn't ask for. They do favors you don't need. They create debt where none should exist. And then they collect. There was a con artist named Daniel Reeves who'd ingratiate himself into people's lives by being helpful. Incredibly helpful. He'd show up when you needed to move. He'd offer to watch your kids. He'd fix things around your house. And people felt grateful. Felt like they owed him. So when he eventually asked for something, usually money or access or information, they couldn't say no. They felt obligated. The debt had to be repaid. But here's what you need to understand. You didn't create that debt. He did. You didn't ask for those favors. He imposed them. And now you're carrying an obligation that was manufactured. That's not how healthy reciprocity works. Healthy reciprocity is mutual. It's balanced. It emerges organically from relationships where both people want to give and receive. Manipulated reciprocity is one-sided. It's strategic. Someone gives and gives and gives, and you start feeling like you're in their debt even though you never wanted to be. How do you protect yourself? Be suspicious of unsolicited generosity, especially from people you don't know well. Notice when someone is doing more for you than the relationship warrants. Notice when favors feel like investments rather than kindness. And here's the hard part. Be willing to accept the discomfort of not repaying what you didn't ask to receive. If someone does something for you that you didn't request and then expects something in return, that's on them, not you. You don't owe someone for violating your boundaries with generosity. You don't owe someone for help you didn't need. The guilt you feel is real, but the debt isn't. And learning to tell the difference might be the most important boundary you ever establish. The 13th truth involves the manipulation of your self-concept. The psychologists found that effective manipulators don't just change how you see them. They change how you see yourself. They amplify certain aspects of your identity and suppress others. They reward the version of you that serves them and punish the version that resists. A man named Aaron Walsh ran a sophisticated manipulation operation through a personal development organization. People joined thinking they'd become better versions of themselves. And in a way, they did. But the version of themselves they became was the version Aaron needed them to be. Compliant, unquestioning, dependent. He'd praise them when they abandoned critical thinking. He'd celebrate them when they isolated from family. He'd tell them they were evolving when really they were dissolving. This is insidious because it feels like growth. It feels like you're becoming who you were always meant to be. But look closely at who benefits from your transformation. If the person guiding your growth also happens to be the person who profits when you become more compliant, more generous, more willing to ignore your own needs, that's not growth. That's grooming. Real personal development makes you more autonomous, not less. It makes you more capable of independent thought, not less. It strengthens your boundaries, not dissolves them. If someone's version of your best self requires you to be smaller, quieter, or more dependent on them, they're not helping you grow. They're pruning you into a shape that's useful to them. The 14th truth is about the weaponization of forgiveness. This one is particularly cruel. Manipulators position themselves as people who've made mistakes and deserve second chances. They use your capacity for forgiveness against you. There was a domestic abuse case involving a man named Christopher Lane who'd been violent with his partner for years. Every time she tried to leave, he'd apologize. He'd cry. He'd go to therapy. He'd say all the right things about change and growth and becoming better. And she'd forgive him, because that's what good people do, right? They forgive. They believe in redemption. They give second chances. But Christopher wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was buying time. Each apology was a reset button that let him continue the cycle. Each promise of change was a lie that prevented her from leaving. And her capacity for forgiveness, which should have been a strength, became the chain that kept her trapped. Forgiveness is powerful, but it's not unconditional. It's not required. And it's definitely not something you owe someone who's hurting you. Real remorse changes behavior. Real accountability includes consequences. Real growth doesn't ask you to forget what happened or pretend it didn't matter or give another chance that will be used the same way as all the others. When someone asks for forgiveness, ask yourself what they're actually asking for. Are they asking for grace while they do the hard work of change? Or are they asking for permission to continue hurting you? Because those are very different things. And only one of them deserves your forgiveness. The 15th truth is the exploitation of your desire to be good, to be kind, to be understanding. Manipulators have figured out that decent people will tolerate almost anything to avoid being seen as judgmental or harsh or unforgiving. So they position their manipulation as something that you'd only resist if you were mean, if you were closed-minded, if you were unwilling to see their side. A woman named Helen Park destroyed a non-profit organization from the inside. When board members started questioning her decisions, she'd frame their concerns as personal attacks, as lack of trust, as failure to support her vision. And because these were good people who prided themselves on being supportive and open-minded, they backed down. They questioned their own concerns instead of questioning her. They chose being nice over being right. And by the time they realized their mistake, the organization was destroyed and Helen was gone. You need to understand this. Being kind doesn't mean being stupid. Being compassionate doesn't mean being naive. Being willing to see someone's perspective doesn't mean abandoning your own. When someone makes you feel like setting a boundary is being mean, that's manipulation. When someone makes you choose between protecting yourself and being a good person, that's manipulation. When someone frames their bad behavior as something you have to accept if you're really as understanding as you claim to be, that's manipulation. Your desire to be good is not a weakness, but it becomes a vulnerability when someone else is willing to exploit it. And the people who manipulate you will always appeal to your better nature, because they know you'll sacrifice your own well-being to maintain your self-concept as a good person. The 16th truth is about the manipulation of normalcy. Manipulators gradually expand what you consider acceptable, what you tolerate, what you accept as just how things are. There was a financial fraud case involving a company called Meridian Investments. Employees were interviewed about how they ended up participating in illegal activities. And every single one said the same thing. It didn't start out illegal. It started with small compromises, little shortcuts, things that felt slightly wrong but not dramatically wrong. And each compromise made the next one easier. Each line crossed made the next line less visible. Within 2 years, people who'd never broken a law in their lives were committing serious felonies. And they didn't even notice the transformation because it happened one tiny step at a time. This is how abuse works. This is how exploitation works. This is how you end up somewhere you never thought you'd be. Someone pushes a boundary just a little, just enough that confronting it feels like overreacting. So you let it go, and that becomes the new normal. Then they push a little further, and again, addressing it feels dramatic. So you adjust, you recalibrate, you accept what yesterday would have been unacceptable. And this process continues until you're so far from your original boundaries that you don't even remember where they were. You don't remember what you used to consider wrong because wrong has been redefined so many times that it's meaningless. The protection here is vigilance about your first boundary, your first no, your first moment of discomfort, because that's where it starts. That's where normalcy begins its slide. If something feels wrong the first time, it is wrong, even if it's small, even if addressing it feels excessive, even if you can't quite articulate why it bothers you. Trust that feeling. Honor that boundary, because if you don't, you won't get another chance. You'll be operating from a new normal that's already been compromised. And the next boundary will be even harder to hold. The 17th truth involves something the psychologists called strategic incompetence. Manipulators will sometimes appear incapable of things they're perfectly capable of doing. They'll make you believe they need your help, your expertise, your saving. And once you've invested in rescuing them, you're hooked. There was a case involving a man named Brian Foster who'd manipulated numerous women through apparent helplessness. He'd need help with finances, with legal issues, with basic life tasks, and the women in his life would step in, would fix things, would take care of him, and each time they did, they became more invested, more attached, more convinced that he needed them. The truth emerged only after his arrest. Brian had a law degree. He'd run successful businesses. He was perfectly capable of managing his own life. But helplessness was his weapon. Incompetence was his strategy. Because rescuing someone creates a bond that's very hard to break.